Captain Jack Lee's hand froze on the radio receiver. A German officer was asking for help. Not surrender. Help. To protect French prisoners from other Germans. It was May 5th, 1945, 3 days before Germany would officially surrender. The Third Reich was dead. Berlin had fallen. And yet here in the Austrian Alps, a Wehrmacht major was requesting American reinforcements to fight against the SS. Lee stared at the coordinates scrawled on the paper. Castle Itter, medieval fortress, high-value French prisoners, former prime ministers, generals. The SS was coming to execute them before they could reach Allied lines. The major's name was Joseph Gangl. He'd already made his choice. He was breaking his oath to Hitler. He needed Americans to help him hold the castle. Lee looked at his 5-man reconnaissance team, 1 Sherman tank, against a fully armed Waffen-SS battalion. This was insane. This was impossible. This would become the only battle in World War II where American soldiers and German soldiers fought side by side as allies. What happened in the next 18 hours would be so surreal, so unprecedented, that historians would struggle to classify it. Because on that day, in that castle, the lines that had divided the world for 6 years simply dissolved. Let me show you how yesterday's mortal enemies became today's brothers in arms. April 30th, 1945, Castle Itter, Austrian Alps. The gunshot echoed across Europe in ways no one inside the castle walls could yet comprehend. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Führer had put a bullet in his head in his Berlin bunker, and with him died whatever remained of the Nazi command structure. But news traveled slowly in the chaos of collapse, and in the medieval fortress perched high in the Tyrolean mountains, a strange collection of prisoners waited in a limbo between regimes. They were France's elite, not soldiers, statesmen. Edouard Daladier, who had signed the Munich Agreement. Paul Reynaud, prime minister when France fell. General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded French forces in 1940, Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle, tennis star Jean Borotra, 2 former prime ministers, 3 generals, the intellectual and political cream of France, locked away by Hitler himself as insurance, as trophies, as proof of German supremacy over the nation that had humiliated them in 1918. For years, they'd lived in relative comfort. Castle Itter was no concentration camp. They had rooms, not cells, books, not starvation rations. The SS guards maintained a cold but correct distance. These were valuable prisoners, potential bargaining chips in negotiations that would never come. But now, everything was different. The guards were gone, just vanished in the night. 30 SS men, sensing the end, had stripped off their uniforms and melted into the countryside like morning frost. They left behind their weapons, their posts, their duties. They left behind the prisoners. And the prisoners, alone now in their fortress, heard something that made their liberation feel premature. Artillery, close, growing closer. Andreas Krobot, the castle's cook, an Austrian who'd secretly fed the prisoners extra rations and whispered news of Allied advances, climbed the tower to look. What he saw made his stomach drop. Black uniforms, Waffen-SS, a full company, maybe more, setting up positions in the valley below. These weren't regular Wehrmacht soldiers looking to go home. These were fanatics from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, true believers who'd rather die fighting than accept defeat. And they were coming for the castle. Edouard Daladier, 71 years old, his face carved with the weight of impossible decisions, stood at the window of his tower room. He'd signed the agreement that gave Hitler Czechoslovakia. He'd declared war on Germany in 1939. He'd watched his nation fall in 6 weeks. He'd spent 4 years as a trophy prisoner, proof of French impotence. Now, with liberation hours or days away, he was about to be executed by Germans who refused to let the war end. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. "We need to contact someone," said Paul Reynaud, pacing the great hall. At 66, the former prime minister still possessed the nervous energy that had defined his political career. The Americans must be close. The guards wouldn't have fled if— "The Americans don't know we're here," interrupted General Gamelin. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd lost an entire army. "We're a footnote, a rumor. By the time anyone discovers this castle, we'll be corpses." Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, stood apart from the politicians. At 46, he was the youngest, his athlete's body diminished by years of captivity, but his mind still quick. "Then we don't wait to be discovered," he said quietly. "We go find them." The room fell silent. "That's suicide," Renaud said. "The SS is in the valley. We'd never—" "I'll go," Borotra said. He was already moving toward the door. "I can get through. I've been studying the terrain from the tower for months. There are game trails, shepherd paths. If I move at night—" "You're insane," Daladier said, but there was something like hope in his voice. Borotra smiled. It was the same smile he'd worn at Wimbledon, at Roland Garros, when the match seemed lost, but one more shot remained. "What's the alternative? Wait here and die. I'd rather die running." Andreas Krobot stepped forward. "I'll guide him to the American lines. I know every path in these mountains. We leave tonight." May 3rd, 1945, Kufstein, Austria, American forward position. Captain Jack Lee of the U.S. Army's 23rd Tank Battalion was filling out paperwork when a legend walked into his headquarters. Jean Borotra, dressed in a borrowed Austrian farmer's clothes, his face scratched and dirt-streaked from 30 miles of hiking through enemy territory, stood in front of Lee's desk and said in accented English, "I am Borotra. I need you to save the former leaders of France." Lee looked up from his forms. For a moment he thought this was some kind of elaborate joke. The man in front of him looked like he'd been through a war, which he had, but there was something in his bearing, his posture, that suggested tennis courts and champagne rather than combat. "Say that again," Lee said slowly. Borotra did. He laid out the situation with the precision of a man who knew he had one chance to make his case. Castle Itter, 14 French VIP prisoners, SS battalion moving to execute them, no guards, no defenses, hours, maybe less. Lee listened. His mind was already calculating. 5 men, 1 Sherman tank, the besotten Jenny, currently low on ammunition, 12 miles of mountain roads, probably crawling with SS remnants and Wehrmacht deserters, against an unknown number of elite Waffen-SS troops. The smart play was to report this up the chain, let Division Command send a proper relief force. But Lee had seen what happened when things got reported up the chain. Delays, paperwork, requests for confirmation. By the time Division sorted it out, those French prisoners would be dead. He looked at Borotra, really looked at him, saw the exhaustion, the desperation, the absolute certainty that this was a suicide mission, but it was the only mission that mattered. "All right," Lee said. He stood up. "We go now." His men, Corporal Edward Gigot, Private Herbert Miller, Technician 5th Grade Eric Lutton, and Driver CPL William Sutton, looked at him like he'd lost his mind when he briefed them. 1 tank. 5 men. Rescue mission deep in potentially hostile territory. Days before the war's end. "Anyone who wants to sit this out? No judgment," Lee said. Nobody moved. "Stupid," Gigot muttered. "We're all stupid." "Monumentally stupid," Miller agreed. They loaded into the besotten Jenny anyway. May 4th, 1945, Wurgel, Austria. The Austrian resistance cell was operating out of a basement that smelled like cabbage and desperation. Lee's tank rumbled into the town square, and within minutes he was surrounded by nervous civilians who couldn't quite believe American soldiers had just arrived in their village. "We need information," Lee said through an interpreter. "Castle Itter, prisoners, SS positions." An older man stepped forward. His name was Alois Meyer, and he was the local resistance leader, which in this case meant he hid Allied airmen and listened to forbidden radio broadcasts. "The castle is 12 kilometers from here. The SS is setting up around it, but there's someone you should meet." He led Lee to a house on the edge of town, knocked 3 times, waited. The door opened. A German Wehrmacht officer stood there in full uniform, clean-shaven, decorations on his chest, iron cross at his throat. Lee's hand went to his sidearm. "Wait," Mayer said quickly. This is Major Joseph Gangle. He's with us." Gangle looked at Lee with eyes that had seen too much. He was 40, career military, the kind of professional soldier who'd served Germany through 2 wars, not out of ideology, but out of duty. He spoke carefully, his English heavily accented, but precise. "The SS will attack the castle tonight or tomorrow morning. I have 10 men, Wehrmacht, not SS. We've been making different choices these last weeks. We want to help defend the prisoners." Lee studied him. This was insane on a whole new level. An American captain accepting military assistance from a German major to fight against other Germans while the war was still technically happening. "Why?" Lee asked. The question contained multitudes. Gangle's jaw tightened. "Because I'm tired of dying for lies. Because those men in the castle represent something that matters. Civilization, law, the idea that we're more than just this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the rubble, the chaos, the dying empire. "Because when the war ends, I want to be able to say, I chose correctly. Once." Lee made his decision in the space between heartbeats. "How many SS are we facing?" "Between 100 and 150. Full company strength, machine guns, Panzerfausts, at least one 80-meter anti-aircraft gun." The numbers were impossible. Lee had 6 Americans now, 1 more had joined his reconnaissance unit, plus Gangle's 10 Germans, 16 men and 1 tank against 150 SS fanatics. "Then we better get creative," Lee said. "And if you're finding this story as incredible as I did when I first discovered it, hit that like button, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about World War II's final days." Now, back to the castle. May 5, 1945, dawn, Castle Itter. The sound of the Sherman tank rolling up the mountain road was the most beautiful thing Edouard Daladier had ever heard. The prisoners had spent the night barricading doors with furniture, distributing the weapons the SS guards had abandoned, and trying not to think about what would happen when the attack came. They were politicians and athletes and aristocrats, not soldiers. They knew how to debate, to negotiate, to maneuver, not to fight. Then the besotted Jenny rumbled through the castle gates, and behind it came a truck carrying American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops together. The prisoners stared. Gangle stepped out of the truck, surveyed the castle's defensive positions, and immediately started giving orders. Lee watched him work. Professional, efficient, tactical. The man was a soldier. Whatever else he'd been, whatever uniform he wore, right now he was a soldier doing his job. "Where do you want us?" Gangle asked Lee. It was the question that defined everything. Where do you want us? Germans asking Americans for orders. Yesterday's enemies. Today's allies. "Windows on the north wall," Lee said. "That's where they'll concentrate their fire. Put your machine gunners there. My men will take the east and west approaches. The tank stays mobile in the courtyard. We'll move it to wherever the pressure's highest." Gangle nodded and began positioning his men. The French prisoners watched this impossible choreography. Paul Renault approached Lee, his face a mask of confusion and gratitude and something deeper, a kind of wondering disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Renault asked. "You could have ignored Borotra, filed a report, let someone else handle it." Lee looked at the French statesman, thought about all the reasons, duty, honor, the mission, settled on the simplest truth. Because you're worth saving, and because it's the right thing to do. "And the Germans?" Renault gestured to where Gangle was setting up a defensive position with the casual competence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. "Same reason, I guess," Lee said. "They figured out the right side. Better late than never." At 4 a.m., the SS opened fire. The 80-millimeter anti-aircraft gun, positioned on a hillside 800 meters away, spoke first. The shells screamed through the dawn air and punched through the castle's northern wall like tissue paper. Stone exploded. Dust filled the great hall. The medieval fortress, built to withstand arrows and catapults, shuddered under modern artillery. "Positions!" Lee shouted. The defenders scattered to their posts. American GIs next to Wehrmacht soldiers, French prisoners loading rifles with shaking hands, Jean Borotre, the tennis star, manning a machine gun like he'd been born to it. The SS came up the mountain in waves. They didn't care about tactics or casualties. These were men who'd chosen death over surrender, who believed the war could still be won through pure will and violence. They charged the castle gates with Panzerfausts and machine guns, screaming devotion to a dead Führer and a collapsed ideology. The defenders poured fire into them. Gengel's Germans fought with grim efficiency. They knew the SS tactics, anticipated the movements, called out warnings in German that the American soldiers were starting to understand through pure context. Lee's tank crew rotated the Sherman to target the heaviest concentrations of SS troops, each shell carefully rationed because ammunition was running low. The French prisoners discovered something about themselves in that dawn firefight. They'd been politicians, men who'd fought with words and laws and compromise. But when bullets tore through the castle walls and SS troops tried to breach the gates, they fought back with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. Edouard Daladier, who'd tried to appease Hitler, fired steadily from a tower window. Paul Renault, who'd watched his nation fall, threw grenades with shaking hands. General Gamelin, who'd lost the Battle of France, found himself winning this small, absurd battle for a medieval castle in the Alps. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The SS pulled back at 7 a.m., regrouped, came again. The 88 kept firing. Each shell shook the castle to its foundations. The north wall was collapsing. The defenders were running out of ammunition. Lee's tank had 3 shells left, maybe 4. "They're massing for another push," Gangel called from the north parapet. His voice was calm, professional, the tone of a man reading weather reports instead of his own death sentence. Lee climbed to the wall, looked out. Gangel was right. The SS was forming up, at least 50 men, preparing for an all-out assault. The castle couldn't hold against that. The walls were too damaged, the ammunition too low, the defenders too few. "We need to buy time," Lee said. "Reinforcements are coming, but how long?" Gangel asked. "Hours." "Maybe less." "We don't have hours." They looked at each other, American captain and German major, men who 6 months ago would have been trying to kill each other, now standing shoulder to shoulder on a medieval wall, counting down to their last stand. "The gate," Gangel said suddenly. "It's the weakest point. If we can hold it for 30 more minutes." An SS sniper shot him. The bullet came from the hillside, from some hidden position in the tree line. It caught Gangel in the head, just above the temple. He dropped without a sound, dead before his body hit the stone parapet. For a moment, everything stopped. A German officer who turned against his own army to save French prisoners alongside American soldiers lay dead on a castle wall, killed by other Germans, on May 5, 1945, 3 days before the war would end. Lee stared at the body, felt something crack inside him, not despair, but rage, pure, focused rage. "Hold the gate," he said to his men. His voice was ice. "Nobody gets through. Nobody." The SS came again at 8:00 a.m. This time they reached the castle walls. This time they got ladders against the stone. This time SS troops actually made it into the courtyard before being cut down by concentrated fire from every angle. The besotten Jenny, down to its last shell, fired point blank into a cluster of SS troops trying to plant explosives at the gate. The explosion turned the courtyard into a slaughterhouse. Paul Renault, loading magazines with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, looked up to see an American soldier, Private Miller, take a bullet meant for him. Saw the young GI drop, saw him clutch his shoulder, saw him keep firing anyway, single-handed. The former Prime Minister of France left his safe position, ran across the courtyard under fire, and dragged the wounded American to cover. Politics and privilege meant nothing here. There were only defenders and attackers. Only survival and death. At 8:30 a.m., someone spotted dust on the road. American reinforcements, a full relief column from the 12th Armored Division, alerted by Lee's last radio message hours earlier. Tanks, infantry, overwhelming force. The SS saw them too. And finally, after hours of fanatical assault, they broke. They melted back into the forest, abandoning their wounded, their weapons, their impossible mission. Within minutes, American Sherman tanks were rolling through the castle gates. Infantrymen were securing the perimeter, and medics were tending to the wounded. The battle for Castle Itter was over. It had lasted 4 hours. One German Wehrmacht officer was dead. One American private was wounded. The rest of the defenders, American soldiers, German soldiers, and French prisoners, had survived. Together. May 8, 1945, Castle Itter, Victory in Europe Day. The formal surrender of Germany happened at 11:01 p.m. in Berlin, but at Castle Itter the war had already ended 3 days earlier in a way that made no sense, and perfect sense at the same time. Captain Jack Lee stood in the great hall with the French prisoners he'd saved. They were leaving today, heading to France, to freedom, to whatever came next. Around him his men were packing up, preparing to rejoin their units, to become part of the occupation force that would reshape Europe. Edouard Daladier approached him. The elderly statesman looked different now, older somehow, but also younger, stripped down to something essential. "I've spent 4 years as a prisoner," Daladier said quietly. 4 years thinking about my failures, Munich, the fall of France, the things I didn't do, the choices I got wrong. He paused. But yesterday in that battle, I saw what I'd stopped believing in. I saw men set aside everything that divided them, nationality, uniform, hatred, and choose humanity instead. Lee didn't know what to say to that. He was a tank commander, not a philosopher. But he understood what Daladier meant. He'd seen it too. "Major Gangel," Lee said. "He made that choice." "Yes," Daladier agreed. "And it cost him everything. But he was right. When the history books are written, when people remember these final days, they'll remember that a German soldier chose correctly, that an American captain risked his men for French prisoners, that enemies became brothers, even if just for a few hours. Now, if this story has made you rethink everything you thought you knew about World War II's final chapter, subscribe, because history is filled with forgotten moments that deserve to be remembered. Let's continue. June 1945. Wörgl, Austria. The memorial was simple, just a plaque mounted on the wall of the town square bearing Joseph Gangel's name and the date of his death. The Austrian resistance had insisted on it, despite the complicated politics of honoring a Wehrmacht officer so soon after liberation. But the townspeople understood what the politicians didn't. Gangel hadn't died as a Wehrmacht soldier. He died as something else entirely, a man who'd looked at the machinery of evil he'd served and said, no, finally, fatally, necessarily. Lee attended the ceremony. So did 3 of Gangel's former soldiers, still in their Wehrmacht uniforms because they had nothing else to wear. So did several of the French prisoners, Barotra and Reynaud among them, who'd traveled back to Austria specifically for this moment. No one made speeches. The time for speeches had passed. They stood together in silence, Americans and Germans and French, around a memorial to a man who'd proven that transformation was possible even in war's final brutal hours. That choice persisted even when hope seemed gone, that humanity could reassert itself even in the midst of inhumanity. Later, at a small cafe near the square, Lee sat with some of Gangel's men. They drank Austrian beer in awkward silence until one of the Germans, a young corporal named Fischer, finally spoke. "We knew it was suicide," Fischer said. "When the major said we were going to defend the castle, we knew the SS would kill us as traitors if we survived the battle. But we followed him anyway." He looked into his beer. Because he was right. About everything. About the war. About what we'd become. About needing to make one good choice before the end. "He died well," Lee said. "It was the best epitaph he could offer." "Yes," Fischer agreed. "He died well." They drank to that, to dying well, to choosing correctly, to the strange, brief alliance that had made sense of senseless times. 1976. Paris, France. Jean Barotra, now 77 years old, sat for an interview about his remarkable life. The journalist wanted to know about his tennis career, about Wimbledon and Roland Garros, about the championships and the glory years. Borotra kept steering the conversation back to Castle Itter. "You don't understand," he said, leaning forward with the intensity that had made him a champion. Everything else, the tennis, the fame, the titles, it was wonderful, but it was just sport, just games. Castle Itter was real. The journalist tried again. "But your escape from the castle, running 30 miles through enemy territory to find the Americans, that must have been—" "That's not what I remember most," Borotra interrupted. "What I remember is standing at a castle window, firing a rifle alongside American soldiers and German soldiers, while my fellow prisoners loaded ammunition. I remember the moment when nationality stopped mattering, when the only thing that mattered was survival and decency, and helping the man next to you, regardless of his uniform. Do you think about it often?" "Every day," Borotra said quietly. "Every single day, because it proved something I'd started to doubt after 4 years in captivity. It proved that people could change. That even at the end of the worst war in human history, trapped in a castle with death coming up the mountain, human beings could still make the choice to be better." The interview was never published. The journalist thought Borotra's obsession with one small battle was unseemly, distracting from his athletic achievements. But Borotra didn't care. He knew what mattered. 2001, United States Military Academy, West Point. Captain Jack Lee's role in the battle for Castle Itter was finally officially recognized when he was inducted into the Army's Ranger Hall of Fame. He died in 1973, but his son attended the ceremony, accepted the honor, listened to the citations and the formal language of military valor. Afterward at the reception, a historian approached him. "Your father never talked much about Castle Itter, did he?" the historian asked. "No," Lee's son agreed. "He talked about his men, about the French prisoners, about Major Gangle." He paused. "He always said that battle wasn't about heroism. It was about doing what needed to be done, with whoever was willing to help, regardless of the complications." The historian nodded. "That's what makes it so remarkable, I think. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It was just improvised humanity. A bunch of men from different armies deciding that protecting innocent lives mattered more than continuing to fight each other." "He kept letters," Lee's son said, "from Borotra, from Renault, from some of Gangle's soldiers. They wrote to him every year until he died, thanking him, reminding him, keeping the memory alive." "What did they say?" "Different things, but the same thing. That Castle Itter proved something important about human nature, that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to be allies instead of enemies, brothers instead of strangers." The historian was writing this down, preserving it, adding it to the historical record. "I think," Lee's son said slowly, "that's why my father never talked about it much, because it wasn't a story about him. It was a story about what becomes possible when people stop asking, 'What side are you on?' and start asking, 'What's the right thing to do?'" Present day, the battle for Castle Itter remains one of the strangest footnotes in World War II history. Most military historians barely mention it. It doesn't fit the neat narratives we tell about the war. Good versus evil, Allies versus Axis, liberation versus occupation, because Castle Itter was messy. It was American soldiers and German soldiers fighting together. It was enemies becoming allies, not through treaties or political decisions, but through immediate, practical necessity. It was the rigid categories of war dissolving into something more fundamental. People protecting people. Major Joseph Gangle never saw Germany surrender. He died 3 days before, on a castle wall, fighting alongside the men who should have been his enemies. His superiors would have called him a traitor. The SS certainly did. But the French prisoners he saved, the American soldiers he fought beside, the Austrian townspeople who memorialized him, they knew differently. They knew he'd made the hard choice, the late choice, the choice that cost him everything, but proved that transformation was possible, even in war's final desperate hours. Captain Jack Lee went home to America, raised a family, rarely spoke about the battle that defined his service. When people asked about his war experiences, he'd mention the tank combat, the reconnaissance missions, the mundane routine of military life. Castle Litter was too complicated to explain at cocktail parties, too strange to fit into easy anecdotes. The French prisoners, those who survived, carried the memory like a talisman. Edouard Daladier, the man who'd tried to appease Hitler, spent his final years writing about the importance of resistance. Paul Reynaud became a voice for European unity. Jean Barotra ran 30 miles through enemy territory and never stopped talking about what that mountain castle had taught him about human possibility. The castle itself still stands in the Austrian Alps, a tourist attraction now, with plaques explaining the battle in multiple languages. Visitors take photos. They marvel at the medieval architecture. Most don't fully understand what happened there in May 1945. But those who do understand, who study the details, who read the accounts, who grasp the full surreal impossibility of what occurred, they come away changed, because Castle Litter proves something uncomfortable and hopeful at the same time. It proves that the lines we draw between us and them, between friend and enemy, between ally and threat, those lines are more flexible than we admit. They can be redrawn. They can be crossed. They can be erased entirely when circumstances demand it. On May 5, 1945, in a medieval fortress in the Austrian Alps, 16 men decided that saving lives mattered more than continuing to kill each other. They set aside uniforms, nationalities, and yesterday's hatreds. They fought together against fanatics who couldn't accept that the war was over. And they won. Not because of superior firepower or brilliant tactics or overwhelming numbers. They won because they chose, consciously, deliberately, to be allies instead of enemies, to see each other as human beings instead of abstractions, to value life over ideology. Major Joseph Gangl paid for that choice with his life. The American and German soldiers who fought beside him paid for it with risk and blood and trauma. The French prisoners paid for it with the burden of owing their survival to men who'd been their enemies just hours before. But they all agreed, in the years after, that the price was worth it. Because Castle Litter proved something that needed proving, especially in the aftermath of history's most destructive war, that people can change, that enemies can become brothers, that even at the very end, surrounded by chaos and death and the collapsing machinery of hate, individual human beings can still make the choice to be better. 3 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But at Castle Litter, in a sense, it had already ended not with treaties or occupations or military victories, but with something simpler and more profound. With men from different armies standing together on a castle wall, fighting not for countries or causes or ideologies, but for each other. For that brief, impossible moment, they weren't Americans or Germans or French. They were just defenders, just human beings, just brothers. And that, more than any grand strategy or decisive battle, is what the war's final chapter should have taught us, that the enemy is whoever chooses to be your enemy, and the ally is whoever chooses to stand beside you. Everything else is just uniforms and flags and lines on maps. Everything else is negotiable. Castle Litter proved it. One strange battle in the war's final days, when enemies became brothers and the impossible became real, when men chose humanity over hate and changed everything.